A nurse paid for an elderly woman's prescription. 2 days later, a lawyer came with life-changing news. The rain drummed softly against the window of the pharmacy, creating a soothing rhythm that contrasted sharply with the chaos of the hospital. Inside, Luna Reyes stood behind the counter, her scrubs slightly damp from the storm outside. She was finishing up her shift as a nurse, ready to head home after a long day. Just as she was about to clock out, a frail voice caught her attention. "Excuse me, dear," said an elderly woman, her frail hands clutching a crumpled prescription slip. It was Mrs. Thompson, a regular patient at the hospital, whom Luna recognized instantly. The woman's silver hair framed a face lined with age and worry. "I need help with this prescription." Luna approached, her heart sinking as she noticed the uncertainty etched on Mrs. Thompson's features. "Of course, Mrs. Thompson. What seems to be the problem?" The elderly woman sighed heavily, and her voice trembled as she spoke. "I went to the pharmacy earlier today, but they said my insurance won't cover this medication. I simply can't afford it." She glanced around, as if the very act of admitting her financial struggles was shameful. "It's for my heart. Without it, I don't know what I'll do." Luna felt a pang of empathy. She had seen this too often. Patients who were unable to afford necessary medications. The healthcare system, with all its complexities, often failed those who needed it most. "Let me take a look," she said, taking the prescription slip from Mrs. Thompson's shaking hands. As Luna read the prescription, her mind raced. How can someone be denied something so critical? The medication was a common heart medication, essential for maintaining stability in patients like Mrs. Thompson. It shouldn't be a luxury. It should be a right. Luna knew all too well how much the elderly relied on these medications to survive, and it infuriated her that financial barriers could dictate life or death. "Mrs. Thompson," Luna started, her voice gentle but firm. "How much is it?" The elderly woman hesitated, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "It's over $100. I don't have it. Not after paying my rent and buying groceries. I just don't know what to do." Luna's heart sank as she thought about her own financial struggles. She was a nurse, after all, but her paycheck barely covered her bills. The thought of using her own savings to help someone else was daunting. Yet, as she looked into Mrs. Thompson's eyes, filled with desperation and fear, Luna felt a wave of determination wash over her. "I'll pay for it," Luna said, before she could second-guess herself. The words slipped out, and she felt a rush of adrenaline. Mrs. Thompson's eyes widened in disbelief. "Oh, sweet girl, you don't have to do that. I can't let you—" "It's okay," Luna interrupted gently. "I want to help. You need this medication. Let me take care of it." After a moment's hesitation, Mrs. Thompson nodded slowly, her relief palpable. "Thank you, dear. You have no idea what this means to me." As Luna processed the transaction, she felt a mix of pride and anxiety. "What am I doing?" she thought. Her savings were dwindling, and she had her own bills to pay. But the thought of Mrs. Thompson going without her medication was unbearable. The kindness of her heart outweighed the nagging voice of caution in her head. Once the transaction was complete, Luna handed the medication to Mrs. Thompson, who clutched it to her chest as if it were a precious treasure. "You're a blessing, Luna. God bless you for your kindness." Feeling a warmth spread through her, Luna smiled. "Just take care of yourself. That's the most important thing." After Mrs. Thompson left, Luna found herself lingering in the pharmacy, staring at the bustling hospital corridor. She felt good about her decision, but the weight of her own financial situation loomed large. What if I can't make ends meet this month? As she clocked out and stepped into the parking lot, the rain had eased. leaving a fresh, earthy scent in the air. Luna pulled her cardigan tighter around her, taking a moment to breathe in the coolness of the evening. She made her way to her car, her mind replaying the day's events. The next day, Luna received a call from Mrs. Thompson. Her heart warmed at the thought of the elderly woman wanting to express her gratitude. "Hello, Mrs. Thompson. How are you feeling?" "Oh, Luna, I'm feeling much better, thanks to you," Mrs. Thompson responded, her voice cracking with emotion. "I wanted to see you and thank you in person. Could we meet at the hospital?" "Of course," Luna said, her heart fluttering with anticipation. "I'll be there in a few minutes." As she drove back to the hospital, Luna felt a mix of excitement and nervousness. She reached the hospital, parked her car, and made her way inside. The familiar sounds of beeping machines and hushed conversations filled the air. When she arrived at the designated waiting area, Mrs. Thompson was already there, her warm smile lighting up the room. "Luna," she exclaimed, her arms opening wide. Luna embraced her, feeling a rush of warmth. "I'm so glad to see you." "I brought you something," Mrs. Thompson said, pulling out a small box from her bag. "It's just a little something to thank you for your kindness." Luna opened the box to find a hand-knit scarf, its colors vibrant and cheerful. "Oh, Mrs. Thompson, this is beautiful. Thank you so much." "It's nothing compared to what you've done for me," Mrs. Thompson replied, her eyes glistening. "You're a special person, Luna. You have a heart of gold." They settled into a nearby waiting area, and Mrs. Thompson began to share stories about her life, her family, and the struggles she had faced. Luna listened intently, feeling a connection with the elderly woman. But just as the conversation was flowing, the atmosphere shifted when a stern-looking man in a tailored suit approached them. Luna recognized him immediately as Victor Chen, Mrs. Thompson's estranged nephew. His presence exuded an air of authority that made the hairs on the back of Luna's neck stand up. "Mrs. Thompson," Victor said, his voice icy. "We need to talk." Luna's heart raced as she exchanged glances with Mrs. Thompson, who seemed to shrink in her seat. "Victor, this isn't a good time," she began, but he interrupted her. "It's about the estate," he said bluntly, eyes narrowing as they fell on Luna. "And you, young lady, are in the way." Luna felt a chill creep over her as she stood up, confronting him. "I don't know what you're talking about," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. Victor leaned closer, a smirk curling at the corners of his lips. "Oh, I think you do. My aunt has been manipulated. You think your act of kindness gives you a claim to her wealth?" "What are you implying?" Luna shot back, her voice rising slightly. "I'm implying that you need to step away from this before it gets messy," he said, his tone threatening. "I have the legal means to ensure that happens." Mrs. Thompson's expression changed from gratitude to distress. "Victor, please. She helped me when no one else would. She deserves our respect." Victor scoffed, his gaze cold. "Respect? You think she deserves anything? You're a fool if you think this will end well for you, Luna." Luna felt her heart pound in her chest. What have I gotten myself into? The warmth of the meeting had evaporated, replaced by the tension radiating from Victor. "Mrs. Thompson, I'm not going to let him intimidate you," Luna said firmly, her voice steady despite the fear coiling in her stomach. "You deserve to be surrounded by people who care about you." Victor's eyes narrowed, and he stepped back, assessing the situation. "We'll see how long that lasts," he said, his voice dripping with contempt. "I will be back." As he turned to leave, Luna felt a mix of anger and determination. She would not let Victor dictate her relationship with Mrs. Thompson. Thank you for standing up for me, Luna, Mrs. Thompson said softly, her voice shaking. I'm sorry you got caught up in this. Luna shook her head, her resolve hardening. We'll figure this out together. Just remember, you're not alone. But as Luna left the hospital that day, she felt a deep sense of foreboding. This was only the beginning. As Luna drove home, her mind churned with the day's events. Victor Chen's dark presence lingered in her thoughts, an ominous cloud threatening to overshadow the warmth she had felt with Mrs. Thompson. What does he want? She wondered, gripping the steering wheel tightly. The tension from their confrontation replayed in her head. Victor's disdainful words, the way Mrs. Thompson had shrunk under his glare. The rain began again, heavy and relentless, mirroring the storm brewing inside her. She parked her car in her small apartment complex's lot and sat behind the wheel for a moment, breathing deeply to calm her racing heart. Focus on what you can control, she told herself. She could help Mrs. Thompson, and she could stand her ground against Victor. Once inside her cozy apartment, Luna kicked off her shoes and let out a long sigh. She felt drained, both physically and emotionally. The last thing she wanted was to think about Victor Chen. But his threat loomed large in her mind. She grabbed a cup of herbal tea, hoping it would soothe her frayed nerves. Sipping the warm liquid, Luna allowed herself to reflect on her work at the hospital. She loved being a nurse. The satisfaction of helping others was deeply fulfilling, but the healthcare system was flawed, filled with bureaucracy and financial barriers that often left the most vulnerable in dire situations. If only more people understood the struggle. Just then, her phone buzzed, breaking her reverie. It was a text from Lila, her best friend and fellow nurse. Hey, you good? Heard there was drama at the hospital today. Let's meet up. Shit. Luna smiled at Lila's unwavering support. She quickly typed back. Yeah, need to talk. How about coffee tomorrow? Sounds perfect. I'll make sure we hit our favorite spot, Lila replied, and Luna felt a flicker of warmth at the thought of sharing her day with someone who understood the pressures of their profession. The next morning, Luna met Lila at their favorite coffee shop, a quaint little place with mismatched furniture and a cozy atmosphere. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee enveloped her as she stepped inside, instantly lifting her spirits. Luna! Lila called, waving her over. You look like you've seen a ghost. What happened? Luna slid into the booth across from her friend, grateful for the distraction. You won't believe it. I helped Mrs. Thompson with her medication, and then her nephew showed up. Victor Chen. Lila's eyes widened. The pharmaceutical executive? What did he want? He threatened me, Luna replied, her voice low. He said my kindness doesn't give me any claim to her wealth. I don't even want it, but I feel like I'm caught in the middle of something I didn't ask for. Lila frowned, her brows knitting together. That's terrible, Luna. You helped her out of kindness. You shouldn't feel guilty about that. I know, but it's just complicated, Luna sighed, taking a sip of her coffee. Victor is determined to push me out of the picture, and I don't know what he's capable of. Have you talked to Mrs. Thompson about it? Lila asked, concern etched on her face. I haven't had the chance, Luna said. I want to support her, but I also don't want to drag her into a fight with her own family. Listen, Lila said, leaning in closer. You're a nurse. You've seen the worst of what people can do, but you've also witnessed incredible acts of kindness. Remember that you're not alone in this. We'll figure it out together. Luna felt a wave of gratitude wash over her. Thanks, Lila. I don't know what I'd do without you. After their coffee, Luna returned to the hospital, her mind still racing with thoughts of Victor. She found herself wandering to the pharmacy, hoping to catch a glimpse of Mrs. Thompson. When she arrived, she was greeted by the familiar faces of her co-workers, but her heart sank when she learned that Mrs. Thompson had been discharged. "She left just before your shift started," one of the pharmacists informed her. The news left Luna feeling unsettled. Where would she go? Mrs. Thompson had no family nearby, and Victor's presence had cast a shadow over everything. Determined to check on her, Luna decided to visit Mrs. Thompson's apartment, which she knew from previous conversations. It was a modest place in a quiet neighborhood, filled with memories of a life well lived. As she approached the apartment building, Luna felt a mix of anxiety and urgency. She knocked on the door, and after a moment, Mrs. Thompson opened it, her eyes widening in surprise and delight. "Luna, what a lovely surprise. Mrs. Thompson, I wanted to make sure you were okay," Luna said, stepping inside. The apartment smelled of lavender and aged paper, a comforting scent that reminded her of her grandmother. "I'm doing better, dear. Thanks to you," Mrs. Thompson said, her voice warm. "I've been resting and taking my medication." "I'm glad to hear that, but I need to talk to you about Victor," Luna said, her tone serious. Mrs. Thompson's smile faltered, and she gestured for Luna to sit. "I know he can be difficult. He hasn't been around in years, but he's still family." Luna took a deep breath, choosing her words carefully. "I'm worried about you. He came to the hospital and threatened me. He doesn't seem to care about your well-being." Mrs. Thompson nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Victor has always been ambitious, but he's also misguided. I tried to reach out to him when I needed help, but he only wanted to control everything." Luna frowned, sensing the pain beneath her words. "You don't have to let him dictate your life. You have people who care about you now, like me." "Dear, you have shown me such kindness," Mrs. Thompson said, her eyes sparkling with gratitude. "But I don't want to drag you into my troubles." "Mrs. Thompson, you are not a burden," Luna insisted, her voice firm. "You deserve to be surrounded by people who love and support you. We can face this together." Just then there was a knock at the door. Luna's heart sank as she exchanged a glance with Mrs. Thompson. "Who could that be?" "I don't know," Mrs. Thompson replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Luna moved cautiously toward the door, peering through the peephole. Her stomach dropped as she recognized Victor's silhouette standing on the other side, his imposing figure radiating an air of authority. "Mrs. Thompson," Victor called, his voice smooth yet menacing. "I know you're in there. We need to talk." Luna's heart raced as she turned to Mrs. Thompson, who looked terrified. "We can't let him in," Luna whispered urgently. "Miss." Thompson nodded, her face pale. "He always had a way of making me feel small." "Then let's not give him that power," Luna said, her resolve hardening. "We'll figure out a way to deal with this together." As Victor continued to knock, Luna quickly grabbed her phone and sent a message to Lila, asking her to come to Mrs. Thompson's apartment. She knew she needed backup. "Luna!" Victor shouted, frustration creeping into his voice. "Open the door! You're making a mistake by ignoring me!" Mrs. Thompson trembled beside her, and Luna placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You're not alone in this. We can stand together." A few minutes later, Lila arrived, her presence bringing a wave of relief. "What's going on?" she asked, glancing between Luna and Mrs. Thompson. "Victor is here, and he's trying to intimidate us," Luna explained in a hushed tone. Lila's expression hardened. "Let's not let him in. We need to be strategic about this." Victor's voice grew louder, demanding access. "This is your last chance, Mrs. Thompson. Let me in, or I'll take legal action." Luna felt her stomach churn. The pressure was mounting, but she refused to back down. "We can't let him control the narrative," she said firmly to Lila and Mrs. Thompson. "Agreed," Lila replied, her eyes fierce. "We need to gather evidence and be prepared for whatever he throws at us." As Victor continued to pound on the door, Luna took a deep breath and addressed Mrs. Thompson. "We need to document everything he says and does. He can't just bully you into submission." Mrs. Thompson nodded, determination replacing her fear. "You're right. I won't allow him to take my voice away." With renewed strength, Luna and Lila moved to the window, peering outside to see if there was any sign of an approaching police officer or support. They had to plan their next steps carefully. The knocking stopped, replaced by silence. Victor's voice came again, more measured now. "I'm only looking out for your best interests, Auntie. You need to let me help you." Luna exchanged a glance with Lila, her heart racing. "He's trying to manipulate you with guilt," she said quietly. "Don't listen to him." Mrs. Thompson straightened, her expression resolute. "I appreciate your concern, Victor, but I am capable of making my own decisions." The door rattled slightly as Victor's frustration grew. "You're making a mistake, Auntie. I'm trying to protect you from people who are only interested in your money." Luna's chest tightened. She turned to Mrs. Thompson, whose face reflected a mix of fear and defiance. "You don't have to justify yourself to him," Luna said softly. "You've lived your life, and you deserve to make your own choices." Mrs. Thompson took a deep breath, her resolve hardening. "Victor, I don't need you to tell me what's best for me. I have people who care about me, and I'm not going to let you intimidate me anymore." Victor's voice shifted, a cold edge creeping in. "You think they care about you? They're just after your money, just like everyone else. You're too old to be making decisions like this on your own." Luna felt a surge of anger at his condescending tone. "Mrs. Thompson is not a child, Victor. She's perfectly capable of deciding who she wants in her life. If you really cared about her, you would support her, not threaten her." Silence hung heavily in the air, the tension palpable as Victor tried to regain control of the situation. "You're making a huge mistake, Luna. If you think you can just swoop in and play the hero, you're wrong. This isn't a fairy tale." Luna stepped closer to Mrs. Thompson, her heart pounding. "This is about more than money. It's about dignity and respect. Mrs. Thompson deserves to be surrounded by people who truly care for her, not someone who only wants to control her." The doorframe shook as Victor pounded on the door again. "Let me in. You think they care. They're using you. You'll regret this." Luna's resolve strengthened. "No, Victor. You're the one who needs to leave. You've neglected your aunt for years, and now you want to waltz back in and dictate her life? It's not going to happen." "Luna," Lila said, her voice steady, yet filled with urgency. "We should call the police if he doesn't leave. We can't let him intimidate you or Mrs. Thompson." "Maybe you should think about your career, Luna," Victor sneered, his voice dripping with disdain. "You think your little nursing job gives you the right to meddle in family affairs? You're just a nurse. What do you know about money or family?" Luna felt a rush of heat at his words, but she refused to let him get under her skin. "You're right. I'm just a nurse. But I know how to care for people. And I know what it means to stand up for someone who needs support. You, on the other hand, are just a bully hiding behind your wealth." Mrs. Thompson's eyes glistened with tears, but this time they were tears of strength. "I won't let you manipulate me anymore, Victor. I'm tired of being afraid of you." Victor's expression darkened, and he leaned closer to the door. "You'll regret this, Auntie. I'm not going to let you throw your life away on some opportunist. Opportunist? Luna echoed incredulously. You're the one who's trying to take advantage of her vulnerability. You don't care about her at all. Just then, a loud crash echoed outside the apartment building. Startled, Luna and Lila exchanged worried glances. What was that? Lila asked, her voice tense. I don't know, Luna replied, her heart racing. But we need to stay focused on Victor. Luna! Victor shouted, his voice a mixture of anger and desperation. You're making a huge mistake. I'll make sure you regret this. No, you're the one who's making a mistake. You need to leave, Luna said firmly. Victor stepped back, and for a moment, it seemed like he might relent. But then he leaned closer to the door again, his voice dripping with contempt. You'll see. I'll make sure you're out of the picture. You don't belong here. Luna felt a surge of determination. I belong wherever I choose to be, Victor, and I choose to be here for Mrs. Thompson. The door suddenly swung open, and there stood Mrs. Thompson, her frail figure framed by the doorway. Victor, you need to leave. Now. Victor's face contorted with rage. You can't be serious. You're just going to throw away everything I've done for you? What you've done is nothing but control and manipulation, Mrs. Thompson said, her voice steady. I'm done with it. Luna stepped beside Mrs. Thompson, feeling a surge of solidarity. You have no right to treat her this way, Victor. She deserves better. With a final glare, Victor turned on his heel and stormed away, muttering under his breath. You'll regret this, both of you. Just wait. As the door clicked shut, Luna felt a wave of relief wash over her. He's gone, she said, her voice trembling slightly. For now. Mrs. Thompson leaned against the doorframe, breathing heavily. Thank you, Luna. I didn't know if I could stand up to him. You did, wonderfully, Luna replied, placing a comforting hand on Mrs. Thompson's shoulder. You showed him that you're not afraid anymore. I have you to thank for that, Mrs. Thompson said, her voice filled with gratitude. You've been a true friend. Just then, Luna's phone buzzed, interrupting the moment. It was a message from Lila. Is everything okay? I heard a crash outside. Luna quickly typed back. Yes, but it was Victor. He threatened us, but we stood our ground. Good. I'm on my way, Lila replied. As Luna put her phone down, she turned back to Mrs. Thompson. Lila is coming over. We can talk more about this and what steps to take next. Mrs. Thompson nodded, her expression still shaken but resolute. I don't want to let Victor intimidate me anymore. I want to take control of my life. Absolutely, Luna replied. You have every right to do that. We can work together to make sure he can't bully you again. A few minutes later, Lila arrived, her expression a mix of concern and determination. What happened? I heard the commotion. Victor showed up and tried to intimidate us, Luna explained, her voice steady. But Mrs. Thompson stood her ground. Good for you, Lila said, giving Mrs. Thompson an encouraging smile. I'm proud of you for standing up to him. We need to document everything he said and make a plan. Mrs. Thompson nodded, her resolve strengthening with each passing moment. I won't let him control my life anymore. I want to set boundaries and make my own decisions. Exactly, Lila said, pulling out a notebook. Let's write down everything we can remember from today. We need to be prepared. As they sat together, Luna felt a sense of camaraderie growing between them. They were in this fight together, and they would not let Victor's threats dictate their lives. We should also consider involving the police if he continues to harass you, Lila suggested, her tone serious. You have rights, and we need to protect them. I agree, Luna said, feeling a surge of determination. We can't let him bully us. Mrs. Thompson deserves safety and respect. With the three of them working together, they began to formulate a plan. They documented Victor's threats and discussed the best approach to take if he returned. Mrs. Thompson shared her wishes for the future, highlighting her desire to take charge of her life and her decisions. As the conversation unfolded, Luna felt a deep sense of purpose. This is what it means to fight for someone you care about, she thought. No longer would she allow fear to control her actions. She was ready to stand up against any challenges that came their way. Suddenly, Luna's phone buzzed again, this time with a message from an unknown number. She hesitated for a moment before opening it. "Luna, it's Victor. We need to talk. I have something that could change everything." Luna's heart raced as she read the message. "What does he want now?" she muttered, glancing at Lila and Mrs. Thompson, who were both watching her intently. "Don't respond," Lila said, her voice firm. "He's trying to manipulate you again. We need to stay strong." "Right," Luna agreed, her resolve solidifying. "We'll handle this together. No more intimidation." As they continued to discuss their plans, Luna felt a surge of determination. She wouldn't allow Victor to control their lives any longer. Together, they would face whatever challenges lay ahead, united in their fight for dignity, respect, and freedom. The following day at the hospital, Luna Reyes walked through the familiar corridors, her mind still swirling with thoughts of Victor Chen and the confrontation at Mrs. Thompson's apartment. She felt a mixture of anxiety and determination. What would Victor do next? As she made her way to the nursing station, she spotted Lila waiting for her, a coffee cup in hand and a determined look on her face. "Hey, did you hear about the meeting scheduled with the hospital administration today?" Lila asked, her voice low but urgent. Luna nodded, her stomach tightening. "I did. It's about improving patient care, right?" "Exactly," Lila replied, her eyes gleaming with enthusiasm. "I think it's the perfect opportunity to address how financial barriers affect our patients, especially the elderly. We can't let their struggles go unheard." Luna felt a rush of hope. "You're right. We can't just focus on the medical side of things. If we don't advocate for them, who will?" Lila grinned, her enthusiasm infectious. "Let's make sure we're prepared. We can share Mrs. Thompson's story as a powerful example of what needs to change." They gathered their notes and headed to the conference room, where the meeting was set to take place. As they walked, Luna couldn't shake the feeling that Victor's shadow loomed over them. What if he tried to intervene? When they entered the room, a mix of nurses, doctors, and administrators filled the seats. The atmosphere buzzed with anticipation as everyone settled in. Luna and Lila took their places at the front, ready to present their ideas. Dr. Hayes, the hospital's chief of staff, called the meeting to order. "Thank you all for being here. Today, we're discussing ways to enhance patient care and address the financial barriers many of our patients face. I want to hear your thoughts." Luna exchanged a glance with Lila, who nodded encouragingly. "We need to take this chance," Luna thought, her heart racing. One by one, colleagues shared their experiences and frustrations. Luna listened intently, feeling the weight of their collective voices. Finally, it was their turn. "Thank you, Dr. Hayes," Lila began, her voice steady. "As nurses, we see firsthand how financial constraints affect our patients' well-being. We want to bring attention to cases like Mrs. Thompson's, who struggled to afford her heart medication, which ultimately impacts her health." Luna felt a surge of confidence as she spoke next. Many elderly patients are forced to choose between their medications and other essential needs. This is a systemic issue that needs addressing. We believe the hospital should consider partnering with local organizations to provide financial assistance to those in need. A murmur of agreement rippled through the room, and Luna's heart swelled with hope. We can also advocate for policy changes at the state level to ensure that medications are accessible and affordable for everyone, especially the elderly. The discussion flowed, and Luna felt empowered by the support of her colleagues. They were uniting for a common cause, and it felt exhilarating. But just as momentum built, Dr. Hayes's expression shifted. We appreciate your passion, but we need to be realistic. Our budget is limited, and implementing these changes will require significant resources. Lila's brow furrowed, but Luna remained composed. I understand that, Dr. Hayes, but we cannot afford to ignore the needs of our patients. If we don't advocate for them, who will? Before Dr. Hayes could respond, the door swung open, and Victor Chen walked in, his presence instantly commanding attention. The room fell silent, the air thick with tension. Excuse me for interrupting, Victor said smoothly, flashing a charming smile that didn't reach his eyes. I couldn't help but overhear the conversation about Mrs. Thompson. I believe I have a solution that could benefit everyone involved. Luna's heart raced as she exchanged a worried glance with Lila. What is he doing here? Mr. Chen, Dr. Hayes said, slightly taken aback. We're in the middle of an important discussion. Victor waved his hand dismissively. I understand, but I believe my input is necessary. Mrs. Thompson is a valued member of our community. Her situation deserves attention, but I think we should consider a more business-oriented approach. Luna clenched her fists, her anger simmering beneath the surface. What do you mean by business-oriented? She challenged, her voice steady. Victor stepped forward, his demeanor shifting to one of authority. I'm suggesting that we create a partnership with my pharmaceutical company. We can provide medications at a reduced cost in exchange for positive publicity for the hospital. It's a win-win situation. A murmur of intrigue swept through the room, but Luna felt a knot tighten in her stomach. That sounds good in theory, but what about the patient's actual needs? Will they really benefit? Or is this just a ploy for your company to gain more profit? Victor's smile faltered, but he quickly regained his composure. I assure you, my intentions are to help. The patients deserve access to quality medications, and I can provide that. By tying it to publicity? Lila interjected, her voice firm. That doesn't address the real problem. We need solutions that put patients first, not profit margins. Dr. Hayes looked torn, glancing between Victor and the nurses. This is an interesting proposition, but we need to consider all aspects before moving forward. Luna felt a surge of frustration. We can't let Victor's business interests overshadow our patients' needs. Mrs. Thompson and countless others deserve genuine support, not corporate manipulation. Victor's expression hardened, and he leaned closer to Luna. You need to understand that I have the resources to make a difference. If you continue to oppose me, I can make your lives very difficult. Luna stood her ground, her heart racing. You can't intimidate me, Victor. I will not back down from advocating for my patients. The tension in the room escalated, and Dr. Hayes raised a hand to regain control. Let's take a moment to regroup. We can discuss these proposals and find a way to move forward that serves our patients best. As the meeting continued, Luna felt a mix of anger and determination bubbling within her. Victor's presence loomed over them like a dark cloud, but she refused to let him stifle their efforts. When the meeting finally concluded, Luna and Lila stepped out into the hallway, their minds racing. I can't believe he showed up like that, Lila said, shaking her head. He's trying to manipulate the situation to his advantage. He's not going to win, Luna said, her voice resolute. We have to keep fighting for what matters. Mrs. Thompson's story is just one of many. Lila nodded, her expression fierce. We'll make sure everyone knows what's really at stake here. As they walked through the bustling hospital corridors, they spotted Mrs. Thompson sitting in the waiting area, her expression weary but determined. "Mrs. Thompson," Luna called, rushing over. "How are you feeling?" "I'm doing well, dear," Mrs. Thompson replied, her voice steady. "I wanted to come by and see how things went in the meeting." Luna exchanged a glance with Lila before speaking. "It was intense. Victor showed up and tried to push his agenda, but we stood our ground." Mrs. Thompson's eyes widened. "I'm proud of you both. It takes courage to stand up to someone like him." Luna felt a swell of gratitude. "Thank you for believing in us. We won't let Victor dictate your life." As they spoke, Luna felt a sense of purpose solidifying within her. They were fighting not just for Mrs. Thompson, but for all the patients who had been silenced by the system. Just then, Luna's phone buzzed again, and she glanced down to see a message from an unknown number. Her heart raced as she opened it. "Luna, it's Victor. We need to talk. I have something important to discuss regarding Mrs. Thompson." Luna's stomach nodded. "Not again," she muttered, glancing at Lila and Mrs. Thompson. "He's trying to manipulate me." "What does he want?" Lila asked, her brow furrowing. "I don't know," Luna said, her voice tight. "But I refuse to give in to his intimidation tactics." Mrs. Thompson placed a reassuring hand on Luna's arm. "You've already shown your strength, Luna. Don't let him get to you." Luna took a deep breath, her determination solidifying. "You're right. I won't let him control this situation any longer." As they continued to talk, Luna felt the support of her friends bolstering her resolve. They would face whatever Victor had planned together, united in their fight for dignity and respect. After the hospital meeting, Luna, Lila, and Mrs. Thompson gathered in a quiet corner to discuss Victor's latest message. The tension was palpable, but they were determined to face this challenge together. "What do you think he wants?" Lila asked, her brow furrowed in concern. Luna shook her head, her mind racing. "I don't know, but it can't be good. He's trying to manipulate the situation again." Mrs. Thompson sighed, her expression weary. "Victor has always been good at playing games. He's never been one to play fair." "We can't let him drag us into his schemes," Lila said firmly. "We need to stay focused on what's best for you, Mrs. Thompson." Luna placed a reassuring hand on Mrs. Thompson's arm. "We're not going to let him intimidate us. Whatever he has to say, we'll face it together." Mrs. Thompson nodded, a spark of determination in her eyes. "I'm tired of being afraid of him. It's time I took control of my own life." Lila smiled, her admiration for the elderly woman evident. "That's the spirit. We're here to support you every step of the way." With a deep breath, Luna opened the message from Victor. "He wants to meet with us. He says he has something important to discuss about you, Mrs. Thompson." Mrs. Thompson's expression darkened. "I can only imagine what kind of important news he has. He's never had my best interests at heart." "We don't have to meet with him if you don't want to," Lila said, her voice firm. "We can ignore his messages and focus on our own plans." "No," Mrs. Thompson said, her voice resolute. "I'm tired of running from him. It's time I faced him head on." Luna and Lila exchanged a surprised glance, but they both knew better than to argue with the determined woman. "Okay," Luna said. "If that's what you want, we'll be right there with you." They agreed to meet Victor at a neutral location, a small cafe just a few blocks from the hospital. As they approached the cafe, Luna felt a knot of tension in her stomach. What is he up to? When they entered, Victor was already seated at a table in the corner, a smug expression on his face. "Luna, Lila, Mrs. Thompson," he said, his voice dripping with false charm. "I'm so glad you could all make it." Mrs. Thompson squared her shoulders, her expression unwavering. "Cut the pleasantries, Victor. What do you want?" Victor's smile faltered, and he leaned back in his chair, his gaze shifting between the three women. "Straight to the point, I see. Very well. I have a proposition for you, Auntie." Luna felt Lila stiffen beside her, and she placed a hand on her friend's arm, silently urging her to stay calm. "A proposition?" Mrs. Thompson echoed, her voice laced with skepticism. "I'm listening." Victor clasped his hands on the table, his eyes narrowing. "As you know, I have significant resources at my disposal. I'm willing to use those resources to ensure your comfort and well-being for the rest of your life." Mrs. Thompson's brow furrowed. "And what would that entail?" "It's simple," Victor said, his tone smooth. "You would come to live with me, and I would take care of all your needs. In return, you would agree to make me the sole beneficiary of your estate." Luna's heart raced as she watched Mrs. Thompson's expression shift from confusion to outrage. "You want me to give up my independence and my home, and in exchange, you expect me to hand over my entire estate to you?" Victor leaned forward, his eyes gleaming. "Think about it, Auntie. You won't have to worry about anything. No more financial struggles, no more relying on the kindness of strangers." "Strangers?" Luna interjected, her voice sharp. "We're not strangers. We're her friends, and we care about her well-being." Victor's gaze shifted to Luna, his expression hardening. "And what do you know about her well-being? You're just a nurse, a temporary fixture in her life. I'm her family, and I know what's best for her." "That's where you're wrong, Victor," Mrs. Thompson said, her voice trembling with emotion. "You haven't been a part of my life for years. These women have shown me more kindness and respect than you ever have." Victor's jaw tightened, and he leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing. "So you're choosing them over your own flesh and blood? Don't be foolish, Auntie. I'm offering you a comfortable life, free from worry." "A comfortable life at the cost of my freedom and dignity?" Mrs. Thompson shook her head, her expression resolute. "No, Victor. I won't trade my independence for your empty promises." Luna felt a surge of pride as she watched Mrs. Thompson stand her ground. Lila squeezed her hand, her eyes shining with admiration. Victor's face contorted with anger, and he slammed his fist on the table, causing the other patrons to turn their heads. "You're making a mistake, Auntie. I'm the only one who can truly take care of you." "No, Victor," Mrs. Thompson said, her voice firm. "You're the one who's made the mistake. I won't let you control my life anymore." Victor's eyes narrowed, and he leaned forward, his voice dripping with venom. "Then you'll regret this. I have the power to make your life very difficult." Luna stepped forward, her own anger rising to the surface. "You can't threaten us, Victor. We won't back down, and we won't let you bully Mrs. Thompson anymore." Victor's gaze shifted between the three women, his expression a mix of fury and defeat. "You'll all pay for this," he spat, before storming out of the cafe, leaving a tense silence in his wake. Mrs. Thompson let out a shaky breath, her shoulders sagging with relief. "Thank you, both of you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I couldn't have done this without you." Luna wrapped her arm around the elderly woman, offering a gentle squeeze. "You were incredible, Mrs. Thompson. We're in this together no matter what." Lila nodded, her expression resolute. "Victor won't win. We'll make sure of that." As they left the cafe, Luna couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. What will Victor do next? But she pushed that thought aside, focusing instead on the strength and resilience they had just witnessed in Mrs. Thompson. We're not backing down. Not now. Not ever. The days that followed their confrontation with Victor were filled with a mix of tension and determination for Luna, Lila, and Mrs. Thompson. They knew that Victor would not give up easily, and they needed to be prepared for whatever he had planned next. As Luna walked through the hospital corridors, she couldn't shake the feeling of unease. She kept an eye out for any sign of Victor. Her senses heightened. She had to protect Mrs. Thompson and ensure that their hard-won progress wasn't undone. During her break, Luna found Lila in the cafeteria, her brow furrowed in concentration as she pored over a stack of documents. "Any updates?" Luna asked, her voice low. Lila looked up, her expression grave. "Unfortunately, yes. I just got off the phone with our lawyer. Victor is threatening to sue Mrs. Thompson for undue influence over her estate." Luna's heart sank. "What? That's ridiculous. We all know he's the one trying to manipulate her." Lila nodded, her lips pressed into a tight line. "Exactly. But he's using his wealth and power to try and intimidate us. He's claiming that you and I have been taking advantage of Mrs. Thompson's vulnerability." Luna felt a surge of anger. "That's not true at all. We're the ones fighting for her, not him." "I know," Lila said, her voice laced with frustration. "But he's playing dirty, and we need to be prepared. Our lawyer says we need to document everything, including any interactions with Victor, to build a strong case." Luna sighed, running a hand through her hair. "Mrs. Thompson doesn't deserve this. She's been through enough." Lila reached across the table, giving Luna's hand a reassuring squeeze. "We're not going to let him win. We'll fight this tooth and nail." Just then, Luna's phone buzzed, and she glanced down to see a message from Mrs. Thompson. "Can you and Lila come to my apartment? Victor is here, and he's not leaving." Luna's eyes widened, and she quickly stood up. "We need to go. Victor's at Mrs. Thompson's place." Lila didn't hesitate, gathering her belongings and following Luna out of the cafeteria. They hurried to Mrs. Thompson's apartment, their hearts racing with concern. When they arrived, they found Mrs. Thompson standing her ground, her expression resolute despite the obvious tension in the room. Victor stood across from her, his face contorted with anger. "This is unacceptable, Auntie," Victor spat. "You're making a grave mistake by siding with these women." Mrs. Thompson held up a hand, her voice steady. "No, Victor. The only mistake I've made is allowing you to control my life for so long." Luna and Lila moved to stand beside Mrs. Thompson, their presence a silent show of support. Victor's gaze shifted between the three women, his eyes narrowing. "You think you can just waltz in and take what's mine? I won't let you." "It's not yours, Victor," Luna said, her voice firm. "Mrs. Thompson is the one who gets to decide what happens to her estate." "Exactly," Lila chimed in. "Your threats and intimidation tactics won't work on us. We're here to support Mrs. Thompson, not to be bullied by you." Victor's expression darkened, and he took a step forward, his fists clenched. "You have no idea what you're up against. I have the resources to make your lives a living hell." Mrs. Thompson stood her ground, her eyes blazing with determination. "Your threats don't scare me anymore, Victor. I'm done letting you manipulate me." The tension in the room was palpable, and Luna could feel her heart pounding in her chest. But she refused to back down. They had come too far to let Victor's intimidation tactics win. Suddenly, a knock at the door interrupted the confrontation, and Mrs. Thompson's expression shifted to one of relief. "That must be the police. I called them as soon as you showed up, Victor." Victor's face drained of color, and he glanced frantically between the three women. "You can't do this to me. I'm your family." "No, Victor," Mrs. Thompson said, her voice steady. "You lost that privilege a long time ago. Now I suggest you leave before the police arrive and escort you out." With a final glare, Victor stormed out of the apartment, leaving a tense silence in his wake. Luna and Lila exchanged a relieved glance, their hearts still racing from the confrontation. Mrs. Thompson turned to them, her eyes shining with gratitude. "Thank you, both of you, for standing by me. I couldn't have done this without you." Luna reached out and pulled the elderly woman into a warm embrace. "We're in this together, Mrs. Thompson. No matter what, we'll face it side by side." As they held each other, Luna knew that the fight was far from over. But with Mrs. Thompson's strength and their unwavering support, they were ready to take on whatever challenges lay ahead. In the days following the confrontation with Victor, Luna, Lila, and Mrs. Thompson found themselves navigating a new landscape of uncertainty and resolve. The police had taken Victor's threats seriously, and while he hadn't returned to the apartment, the fear of his next move lingered in the air. Mrs. Thompson, though shaken, had found a renewed sense of strength. With Luna and Lila by her side, she began to reclaim her life, taking steps to ensure her independence was preserved. They worked together to gather evidence of Victor's intimidation tactics, compiling messages and documenting every interaction. One afternoon, while sitting in Mrs. Thompson's cozy living room, they discussed the next steps. "I think we should reach out to a local advocacy group for the elderly," Lila suggested, her enthusiasm infectious. "They might have resources that can help us." Mrs. Thompson nodded, her determination shining through. "I want to ensure that no one else has to go through what I did. If I can help others, it'll be worth it." Luna smiled, feeling a swell of pride for the woman they had grown so close to. "That's the spirit. We can create a support network for others facing similar challenges. Together, we can be a voice for change." As they made plans, Luna's phone buzzed with a new message. She glanced down, her heart racing as she read the name. It was Victor. "I think he's trying to provoke us again," she said, showing Lila and Mrs. Thompson the message. "Let's not respond," Lila replied, her voice steady. "We've already involved the police, and they advised against engaging with him." Mrs. Thompson took a deep breath, her resolve unshaken. "I won't let him control my life anymore. If he wants to threaten me, he'll have to face the consequences." Days turned into weeks, and the trio worked tirelessly to prepare for their upcoming meeting with the advocacy group. They wanted to ensure that their message was clear, and that they were ready to share their experiences, shedding light on the issues faced by the elderly in the community. On the day of the meeting, Luna felt a mix of excitement and nerves. They arrived at the community center, where a group of passionate individuals had gathered, eager to discuss the needs of the elderly and create actionable solutions. As Luna, Lila, and Mrs. Thompson took their seats, they were greeted by the chairperson of the group, a woman named Angela. "Thank you all for being here today. We're excited to hear your stories and learn how we can support our elderly community better." Mrs. Thompson stood up, her heart pounding. "Thank you for having us. I want to share my experience with you all, and how important it is to advocate for those who feel they have no voice." As she spoke, Luna felt a surge of pride wash over her. Mrs. Thompson's story resonated with everyone in the room, and the attention she received was a testament to the strength and resilience she had shown throughout her ordeal. After Mrs. Thompson finished sharing her story, Luna and Lila took turns discussing their involvement and the need for systemic changes within the healthcare system to protect vulnerable patients. The room buzzed with energy as more members joined in, sharing their ideas and experiences. "I think we should create a petition to demand better resources for elderly patients," one member suggested. "Absolutely," Lila agreed. We can also advocate for financial assistance programs that ensure no one has to choose between their health and their finances. As the meeting progressed, Luna felt a sense of community forming. They were all united for a common cause, ensuring that the elderly had a voice and access to the care they needed. When the meeting concluded, Mrs. Thompson was approached by several attendees, all eager to express their admiration and support. Luna watched as Mrs. Thompson's confidence grew, her spirit lifting with every kind word. As they left the community center, Mrs. Thompson turned to Luna and Lila with tears of gratitude in her eyes. "Thank you for helping me find my voice again. I didn't think I could do this, but you both gave me the strength to fight back." Luna wrapped her arms around Mrs. Thompson, feeling the warmth of their friendship. "You did this, Mrs. Thompson. You are an inspiration." Days turned into weeks, and as the advocacy group gained momentum, they organized a rally to raise awareness of the challenges faced by the elderly. Luna, Lila, and Mrs. Thompson were at the forefront of the movement, speaking passionately about the need for change. The rally drew a crowd that surpassed their expectations. As Luna stood on the stage, looking out at the sea of faces, she felt a rush of hope. "Together, we can create a world where everyone's voice is heard and no one is left behind," she proclaimed, her voice ringing with conviction. The crowd erupted in cheers, and Luna felt the power of unity surging through her. They were making a difference, and it felt exhilarating. As the rally came to a close, Luna received a text from the police department. Victor had been served with a restraining order, effectively putting an end to his intimidation tactics. They had gathered enough evidence to show that he had crossed the line, and Luna couldn't help but feel a sense of relief wash over her. That evening, as they celebrated their victories, Mrs. Thompson raised her glass. "To new beginnings," she declared, her eyes shining with joy. "To new beginnings," Luna and Lila echoed, their hearts full. As they toasted, Luna realized that while the journey had been fraught with challenges, it had ultimately led them to a place of strength and empowerment. They had stood together against adversity, and now they were paving the way for others to do the same. With renewed purpose, Luna knew that they would continue to fight for those who couldn't fight for themselves, ensuring that everyone had access to the care and support they deserved. You've made it to the end. If you enjoyed this story, I am confident that you'll love the next one appearing on the screen now. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and please give this video a like. I'll see you in the next one.